What's going on, dear viewers? This is your gracious host, Kaine Walker. From time to time, I do the foolish thing of encountering arguments and going down rabbit holes. As an enjoyer of fighting games, I've come across a particular argument regarding what is actually considered a fighting game. Most other fans of subgenres like arena brawlers and whatever these are, and the like, seem to be fine with being classified as their own thing, most of the time. And no one really makes a stink about it, you know. Ninja Storm, Budokai, J-Stars, Jump Force, etc. But for some reason it gets really different when we discuss this next one. Well, I've stalled long enough. You saw the video title. Let me just go ahead and answer the question, why is Smash not a fighting game? Let's begin. Firstly, let's get into one of the many reasons why I think this. We label things based on what came before, not what came after. It is ridiculous to insist something should wear a certain label when it does not meet prior established criteria. Many such discussions are a byproduct of this phenomenon. Is a hot dog a sandwich? Is water wet? Is cereal a soup? Are video games art? What is a one? Sorry, it seems I experienced some technical difficulties. Where was I? Oh yeah, Smash Bros. Being a fighting game. You see, people have very weak arguments in favor of this, such as, it is a game where characters are fighting, therefore it is a fighting game. It's an oversimplification of what a fighting game is, which brings me to another disingenuous argument. What is a fighting game? See, this is normally said in response to stating that Smash is not a fighting game. And this is the most inherently dishonest argument out of all of them, because it assumes that if you can't parse out what a fighting game is in simple terms, or at all, within this one discussion, that it can't be said that Smash is not a fighting game. Which is bullshit for two reasons. 1A, if you're so sure that Smash is a fighting game, why are you asking me what one is? As if saying, prove it, when I say it isn't one, validates you as correct. 1B, this trick question assumes there's no criteria for what constitutes a fighting game, which can't be the case, because why would Smashers want the label so bad if it meant nothing, or such criteria didn't exist? You know, when definitions are this flexible, they may as well mean nothing. What I want to know is why the label is so important to them, and why they're so uncomfortable being their own thing, but we'll get more on that later. 1C, how the fuck does it make sense that if there's no definition of what a fighting game is, that Smash is one? So my main question is, how can you assume Smash is a fighting game if you don't even know what a fighting game is? Or if you need someone else to define it for you? And I know what some of you who use that argument are thinking. It doesn't mean you don't know what a fighting game is. Okay, but why do you have to pose that question in order to surmount yourself as correct in the discussion? Do you not see how it's a trick question? Anyway, the problem with the way people argue about this is the fact that what you don't understand is that by asking this question, you're telling on yourself. Because what's understood does not need to be explained. Because at the end of it all, you have to convince me and others that think like me that Smash is a fighting game, while I will never have the problem of having to convince anyone that Street Fighter, Tekken, King of Fighters, Art of Fighting, Virtual Fighter, Marvel vs. Capcom, etc. in fact are fighting games. And you have to ask yourself why that is. The answer to which isn't complicated. It's because they take from the blueprint of Capcom's Street Fighter / Street Fighter 2. I understand that it would be difficult for some people to accept this because they don't like to feel excluded, but some things are not defined by simple or singular terms. Some things are defined by their birth and their existence, their inception, how they began. They are simply defined by what has always been and what came before. The criteria and observable characteristics therein. I'll use a famous argument to illustrate this. If it walks like a duck, swims like a duck, and quacks like a duck, then it's probably a duck. In essence, this argument is a form of inductive reasoning, arguing that if an entity shares key characteristics of another entity, it can be reasonably identified as such. However, there is an inverse to this argument. Even though it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it might not be a duck. This argument's reasoning focuses on caution against jumping to conclusions based on limited or misleading similarities, suggesting that underlying differences or hidden variables could lead to a different identification. In conclusion, Smash is not a duck. Let's see who can read between the lines. It's all one big scramble for legitimacy. Some people are not comfortable with Smash being its own thing, and because they just want to be included, they need the perceived prestige that comes with certain labels. They seem to have a need for what I've coined as the clout of consideration from being counted as a fighting game, and God knows why. How the fuck is it completely uncontroversial to say Tekken and Smash are nothing alike? Yet when I suggest that maybe they shouldn't share the same label, it's a shitstorm. I actually took a while to run my own reasoning through ChatGPT, and considering this video is probably the only one on YouTube that even bothers to make an argument against the swaths of Smash is a fighting game videos, well shit by default, but I think I've done the best at illustrating the point for our side. That is, the side that believes Smash is not a fighting game. And obviously anyone's free to try and respond to this and refute anything I've said here and point out the flaws in the logic and all of that, but I believe this to be fucking ironclad. Why Smash Brothers is not a fighting game. Even though Smash Brothers shares some traits with traditional fighting games, these traits do not necessarily make it a fighting game. Here's how you might break this down. A priori reasoning. You can argue that, by definition, a fighting game is a genre defined by certain core features, e.g. Street Fighter style combat. You could define a fighting game as a one-on-one combat game focused on health depletion as the main victory condition. Static arenas with no dynamic environmental factors, only focusing on the character's abilities and movements. Using this a priori reasoning, you could argue that Smash Brothers doesn't fit the strict logical definition of a fighting game because 1. It's not strictly 1 versus 1. While 1 versus 1 is possible, Smash Brothers allows up to 4 players, often with free-for-all elements. Many fighting games focus primarily on one-on-one encounters, percentage meter versus health bars. Traditional fighting games use health bars, whereas Smash Brothers uses a percentage-based system to show how easy it is to launch a player off the stage. This system is fundamentally different from reducing a health bar to 0. 3. Stage dynamics. In Smash Brothers, the stages themselves play a huge role. They could feature moving platforms, hazards, and changes that significantly affect gameplay, which is very different from the static, minimalist stages found in most fighting games. 4. Item use and randomness. Smash Brothers incorporates items, power-ups, and random events, which are rare or absent in traditional fighting games. Even though Smash Brothers shares some traits with fighting games, characters fighting, combos, and counters, these are not sufficient to logically define it as a fighting game. The a priori conclusion here is that Smash Brothers may resemble a fighting game in some respects, but based on what we logically define as a fighting game, it is not one. A posteriori reasoning. You could also use a posteriori reasoning by drawing on empirical evidence to suggest that Smash Brothers differs significantly from fighting games. Experiential differences. Players' experiences in Smash Brothers are very different from those in traditional fighting games. The chaotic multiplayer nature, the heavy reliance on stage design, and the presence of items all create a different gameplay feel. Community distinctions. The competitive community often debates whether Smash Bros. Belongs in the same category as games like Tekken or Street Fighter. Even tournament formats for Smash Brothers, like turning off items or playing on specific stages, highlight how the game needs modification to fit more into the mold of competitive fighters, which suggests it's not innately a fighting game. Genre blending. Empirically, Smash Brothers incorporates platforming and party game elements, making it feel more like a hybrid than a pure fighter. A comparison to other platformers like Mario Party or Kirby might reveal that its mechanics diverge too much from what we typically see in a fighting game. The complete outline. Super Smash Brothers is not a fighting game. 1. Walks like a duck. A posteriori argument for fighting game status. Based on observation, Smash Brothers has combat, special moves, and competitive play. Similar to traditional fighting games, Street Fighter, Tekken, it involves battling opponents. However, these traits don't capture the full context or genre. 2. The inverse. A priori and a posteriori arguments against fighting game status. A priori. By the logical definition of fighting games, Smash Brothers lacks essential characteristics, e.g. 1 versus 1 focus, static arenas, health depletion. Therefore, it's not a true fighting game. A posteriori. Experience shows that Smash Bros. Plays more like a hybrid of platformer, party, and fighter genres. The chaotic nature of the game, use of items, and dynamic stages create a distinctly different experience from other fighting games. Conclusion. Even though Super Smash Bros. Walks like a duck, i.e. shares traits with fighting games, both a priori reasoning, based on definitions, and a posteriori reasoning, based on experiences, show that it doesn't fully belong to the fighting game genre. Instead, it's a unique blend of multiple genres, making it something else entirely. Now, there were a couple arguments in here that you could pick out and try to debate, but it's still an argument that's predicated on some form of sophistry anyway. It's not a complete argument. You can argue against these couple things, right? A one-on-one combat game. We can argue this point right here and say, oh, what about team-based fighters? They feature 2-on-2 or 3-on-3 combat. Alright, you got that. But guess what though? One character is on screen at a time, even in those games, and there is no option to change that. And if there is an option to change that, like in something like Street Fighter X Tekken, it's a fun alternate game mode that's meant for some dumb fun. No one is meant to take that seriously in the slightest. Now, I might as well slip this in here too, because this is actually a terrible argument for why Smash isn't a fighting game. People say Smash isn't a fighting game because Smash is not competitive, and this is two forms of fallacy that I can't name right now, but it's a bad argument because it's founded on bad reasoning, and kind of something that's just not true. I won't say a lie because I don't think people do it intentionally. Lies imply intent. First of all, Smash is competitive. You can make anything competitive. Cup stacking is competitive. Like, why the fuck can't Smash be competitive? That is a horrible argument for why it's not a fighting game. It's terrible. I don't know why people make it. What else? Focused on health depletion. Yes, focused on health depletion most of the time. Okay, it did say as the main victory condition, so I guess the argument I was gonna try and steal, man, doesn't really work anymore. But we know there's ring outs in some games, but guess what? That's like one of the scummiest ways to win ever. I don't want people to think I'm being unfair, so I actually tried to get the AI to come up with a way it could argue against this reasoning. I deliberately said, for the sake of fairness and steel manning the dissenting position, how would someone argue against this with the least amount of sophistry? Like a completely honest debate about it, like refute it point by point. So here's the argument for the position of Smash being a fighting game, and I want people to know I'm trying to be fair, I'm not trying to be dismissive, and I've been looking at this argument for a long while, and I've been trying to figure out in my head why people might say that Smash is a fighting game, but the thing is, it dilutes the label too much for it to be considered one. And if you're fine with that, okay, well, you want a label that means nothing at that point. Here we go. Arguments for Smash Bros. Being a fighting game. 1. Broader definition of fighting games. A priori. The definition of a fighting game does not need to be overly narrow. The genre is defined by competitive combat between characters where the goal is to defeat opponents using a variety of attacks, counters, and combos. By this broader definition, Super Smash Bros. Clearly qualifies. Fighting games can include a variety of mechanics, and while many classic fighting games focus on 1 versus 1 battles with health bars, this isn't required to define the genre. Genre definitions evolve over time, and Super Smash Bros. Represents an innovation in the genre rather than an exclusion from it. Counter to your a priori argument. Now it's countering the a priori argument for why Smash isn't a fighting game. So, your argument sets up a strict, perhaps outdated definition of a fighting game. Static stages, 1v1, health depletion. However, genres are inherently flexible and evolve as new games push the boundaries of what's possible. Super Smash Bros. Expands the genre just as games like Tekken and Mortal Kombat did when they introduced their own unique mechanics and features. Other fighting games also feature things like interactive arenas, e.g. Injustice and Dead or Alive, which support the idea that stage dynamics are not a disqualifying factor. 2. Smash Bros. Shares core mechanics with fighting games. A posteriori Posteriori. Empirical experience shows that Super Smash Bros. Shares core gameplay mechanics with fighting games. It's focused on player versus player PvP combat, relies on complex movesets, has frame data, and requires careful timing and strategy, core elements found in Street Fighter, Tekken, and other fighting games. Combos, timing, hitboxes, spacing, and counters are critical in Smash Bros., which are hallmark mechanics of traditional fighters. The competitive community uses techniques like edge guarding, DI, directional influence, and frame perfect inputs, all of which are core skills in high-level fighting gameplay. Counter to your A Posteriori argument. Your argument that the game includes randomness, items, dynamic stages, and multiplayer modes is fair, but these elements can be disabled in competitive play, making Smash Bros. Behave more like a traditional fighter. Competitive tournaments often standardize rules to focus purely on fighting mechanics, turning off items, and restricting stage selection, making it no different from other fighting games where players fight on an even playing field. Many traditional fighting games have adopted modes that allow more than 2 players, e.g. Tekken Tag Tournament, showing that player count alone does not define the genre. I can't believe I forgot about that game when talking about team fighters. 3. Tournament play and competitive scene. A Posteriori. Empirically, Super Smash Bros. Has a dedicated competitive scene with tournaments and professional players, much like other fighting games. If the competitive gaming community recognizes it as a fighting game, and it has spawned numerous tournaments, including prestigious events like EVO, then there is strong evidence it belongs in the genre. Fighting games are defined by their depth of combat and high-level play. The competitive scene around Smash demonstrates that it offers that depth, even if the casual experience is more chaotic or party-like. Many fighting games have both casual and competitive appeal, e.g. Mortal Kombat, which balances flashy fatalities with deep mechanics. 4. Genre blending is common in gaming. A priori. Smash Bros. Being a blend of platforming and fighting elements doesn't disqualify it from being a fighting game. Many games blend genres, and this doesn't mean they don't fit within one genre, and one game can belong to more than one genre. Super Smash Bros. Can be both a platformer and a fighting game without diminishing its status as either. Counter to your argument about genre blending. You argue that Smash Bros. Is a hybrid, but many fighting games include elements from other genres without losing their core identity. For example, Mortal Kombat includes story modes and environmental hazards, but these don't make it any less of a fighting game. Similarly, the fact that Smash Bros. Incorporates platforming mechanics doesn't strip it of its fundamental fighting game status. 5. Inclusive versus exclusive definitions. A priori. A strict definition that excludes games like Super Smash Bros. Risks becoming too exclusive, limiting the genre to only a handful of games. Genres are best understood as broad categories that include variations and innovations. By a more inclusive definition, Smash Bros. Fits comfortably within the fighting game genre due to its focus on combat mechanics and competitive depth. Counter to your a priori definitions. Your definition of fighting games might be too limiting and overlook the natural evolution of genres. Fighting games today are more than just 1v1 bouts in small static arenas. They've grown to include elements like stage hazards, 3D movement, and unique victory conditions. Excluding Smash Bros. Because it doesn't fit a narrow definition overlooks its innovation and ignores how genres change over time. In conclusion, in Steel Manning the Dissenting View, the least sophistic argument would focus on 1. Broadening the definition of fighting games to include variations that Smash Bros. Represents. 2. Relying on core mechanics like competitive combat, combos, and timing that exist in both Smash Bros. And traditional fighting games. 3. Recognizing the competitive community and tournament play as evidence that Smash Bros. Holds up as a serious fighter. 4. Acknowledging genre blending without disqualifying a game from a genre. This line of reasoning argues that Smash Bros. Is part of the fighting game genre, albeit a unique and innovative example. By focusing on broader, more inclusive definitions of the genre, the dissenting position avoids falling into overly narrow or exclusionary thinking. This presents a strong counter to your argument without dismissing it unfairly. Alright, now that I've laid out my argument alongside, I would say, the best possible argument for why Smash is a fighting game, what I'm gonna do is argue against what I've deemed to be the best and most honest argument for why Smash is a fighting game. The first point, with the broader definition of fighting games. The fact that you would have to essentially change the definition of a fighting game in order to be included is absolutely proof that Smash is not a fighting game. I don't really think I have to elaborate any further than that. What does it say when you have to perform mental gymnastics and completely rewrite the qualifications or standards of something in order for you to fit? Addressing the counter to my a priori argument for why Smash is not a fighting game. It says my argument sets up a strict, perhaps outdated definition of a fighting game. Again, distinctions and standards exist for a reason. Those standards and distinctions are where a label derives its meaning. Next, it claims that genres are inherently flexible. I would assert no, they're not. Genres are not inherently flexible because any new genre or any combination of genres that gave birth to a new one is derivative of something that came before it. There would be something prior to distinguish this new thing from the old things. So in essence, you're not bending the rules of the prior existing genre. You're simply creating or establishing a new one based on rules derived from the other one or the other two or so genres that you are derived from. My example for this would be Metroidvania. How far does something have to evolve before it's simply not of the same ilk? In that it is far too different to even be called the thing it is attempting to be under the same label as. It continues. Super Smash Bros. Expands the genre just as games like Tekken and Mortal Kombat did when they introduced their own unique mechanics and features. Other fighting games also feature things like interactive arenas, e.g. Injustice and Dead or Alive, which support the idea that stage dynamics are not a disqualifying factor. Now, the innovations that Tekken and Mortal Kombat brought to fighting games had nothing to do with the things that Smash brought to fighting games. Quotation marks. What Tekken did differently from Street Fighter is the lack of a super meter and adding a third dimension, which would drastically change the meta of that type of game to involve heavy movement. You can move in circles, you could move left and right as well as up and down. There's wall combos, etc. With Mortal Kombat, it pretty much stuck to the same formula as Street Fighter minus proximity blocking, where they opted to have a block button, where they made the uppercut a universal anti-air option, and obviously the most famous example, fatalities, and then brutalities, animalities, babalities, etc. So even the two examples chosen take from the blueprint of Street Fighter in more than just characters fighting. I'm sure anyone with an honest bone in their body could find the similarities between Tekken, Mortal Kombat, and Street Fighter without me having to outline that here in this video and having this take all day. The next point, with interactive arenas. The context means everything here. With interactive arenas, when it comes to Injustice, Dead or Alive, and Mortal Kombat, those are not random occurrences. Both players have the opportunity to use those things, and it is a reward for skilled play. It is not random in the slightest, though it could be argued that introducing those things interferes in some way with it being a completely even playing field, which I would disagree with for my reasons stated, but I digress. Context is everything. It's not a dragon showing up out of nowhere and bathing the entire stage in fire. Next, it says Smash Bros. Shares core mechanics with fighting games. In the most cursory sense imaginable, yes it does. PvP, movesets, frame data, timing and strategy, which I could argue that is in pretty much every competitive video game ever, not even just fighting games. And also, it removes the context behind how each of these singular mechanics is applied in Smash Brothers or Street Fighter, etc. It also removes the context of how heavily it deviates from the formula of games like Street Fighter, etc. It says, your argument that the game includes randomness, items, dynamic stages, and multiplayer modes is fair. I don't think I need to elaborate further. It gave me the point for that. That is true. In the way Smash was meant to be played, those things were ingrained in its design philosophy. It then goes on to say these elements can be disabled. And what it means to say is these elements have to be disabled in competitive play in order for it to fit in the mold of a traditional fighter. So essentially, you're having to take away features from the game as it was meant to be played in order to pretend to be an actual fighting game. How is that not proof that Smash isn't one? How? Like, you can't argue against that. You have to go into the settings and change the way the game was meant to be played in order to make it function sorta kinda like a fighting game. There's no getting around that. It goes on to say many traditional fighting games have adopted modes that allow more than 2 players. Uses Tekken Tag Tournament as an example. I use Street Fighter Cross Tekken. Showing that player count alone does not define the genre. Actually, that is a pretty big component of what defines the genre. And again, it ignores context. If we were to play 4 players in Tekken Tag Tournament or Street Fighter Cross Tekken, that would be 1 player per character on a team of 2 versus 2. Meaning that the standard layout of the game is still the same. It would be 1 character from each team on screen at a time. And whether you tag in or tag out is still just 1 character from each team. So the context of how the player count is applied is being ignored. It's not portraying what Tekken Tag or Street Fighter Cross Tekken is supposed to be, as it's meant to simulate the regulatory nature of tournament style martial arts. Tournament play and competitive scene. Whether or not there is a competitive scene for something does not define something's genre at all. I don't even think speedrunners would say something like this. Like a certain game having a sort of scene or a niche group that convenes to play it in a certain way does not define what kind of game it is. That's silly. So tournaments existing or not existing don't matter. Not for this argument. It goes on to say if the competitive gaming community recognizes it as a fighting game, which is debatable, hence this video, and it has spawned numerous tournaments including prestigious events like EVO. Smash has spawned EVO. Pretty sure that was a typo. I'm gonna ignore that. I think I know what it's trying to say. And there is strong evidence it belongs in the genre. That's not evidence that it belongs in the genre of fighting game. Saying that is the same as saying Mario Kart was at EVO, so there's strong evidence to suggest it's a fighting game. No, that's being somewhere where a certain thing is commonly played does not make it the same as that thing. That's ridiculous. Fighting games are defined by their depth of combat and high level play, not necessarily, especially with modern fighting games. Also, with the first fighting game being Street Fighter 1. And even if you don't count Street Fighter 1, Street Fighter 2 was very simplistic before the introduction of its future iterations. So that's not necessarily true either. Things are more than the sum of their parts. It says many fighting games have both casual and competitive appeal. Well, appeal is a completely different thing to what's being said here. Casual appeal is definitely not taken into account when it comes to the design philosophy of fighting games. That was never the case, especially when some of these things were designed to be straight up quarter munchers. And we also have to define the word casual in this sense. Genre blending is common in gaming. Smash Bros. Being a blend of platforming and fighting elements doesn't disqualify it from being a fighting game. Yes, it does, and I'm gonna tell you why. Because it doesn't tell the full story. And you're trying to surmount people's understanding of what a fighting game is. And I hate using this word, traditionally. Many games blend genres, and this doesn't mean they don't fit within one genre. Actually, it does mean they don't fit within one genre, because it's the combination of more than one thing. It's like zebras. They have multicolored stripes. Therefore, to say zebra is black by itself with no further clarification is wrong, because it's an oversimplification. It's not entirely true. The full context is not being displayed. I gave the example of Metroidvania. It was a blend of platforming elements from games like Super Mario and the elements from RPG and action-adventure style games, but guess what? They didn't try to take one of those individual labels. They made their own, derivative from the titles of the 2 games that made the genre, Metroid and Castlevania. It's its own thing with its own label as a result of combining different genres mechanics. Why Smash can't do that same thing and make its own thing up? I don't know. Why does the community reject this possibility? I have no idea. It's to the point where they bullied their creator into saying that it is a fighting game when At first he said it wasn't. It makes some other arguments here that I don't even believe I have to waste a lot more time on. It says my argument that Smash Brothers is a hybrid is flimsy because something can be a hybrid while still belonging to one genre, and it uses Mortal Kombat story mode as a reason for that. Do I really have to explain why that is a faulty and flimsy premise? Goes on to say that Smash, including platforming elements, doesn't strip it of its fundamental fighting game status. Yes, it does, because fundamentally, fighting games do not involve platforming. Inclusive and exclusive definitions. A strict definition that excludes games like Super Smash Bros. Risks becoming too exclusive. What the hell does that mean? Limiting the genre to only a handful of games. There's way more than a handful of fighting games. I have no idea what you're saying here, arguing with no one in particular. So that's already proven false by demonstration of how many fighting games I can name that are a derivative of the Street Fighter blueprint, while still managing to add new mechanics that further define the genre without deviating too far. Genres are best understood as broad categories that include variations and innovations. No, they're not. Genres are best understood strictly because when you take a game like Guilty Gear, it is absolutely a fighting game, but it is a fighting game with more things added on top of traditional fighting game mechanics. It's stuff added on top. It's not something that's made completely devoid of the design philosophy of what started the genre while still attempting to claim the label. If I missed anything, or if you think I'm running from a particular discussion or argument that I could have made in this video, let me know in the comment section. But I've gone on long enough. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, do all the YouTube things, and click the links in the description to keep your finger on the pulse of Cosmogoth. This is your gracious host, Kaine Walker, signing off, and I will see you all again next time. Peace.
What?